Now, Volodymyr Zelensky has been holding talks with Donald Trump in New York. The Ukrainian president's in the US trying to get bipartisan support for his country's war against Russia's invasion. The Republican presidential nominee has repeatedly criticized the Biden administration for paying too much for Ukraine's campaign. The White House has just pledged nearly $8 billion in new military funding, but Mr. Zelensky needs support far beyond November's presidential election. Let's catch up with DW's chief international editor, Richard Walker, in Washington. Welcome, Richard. There was some question as to whether this meeting would actually take place. What are your impressions now that it has?
Yeah, well, we've been seeing brief comments that the two leaders made before and after their meeting together. And yeah, I think you can kind of bring together some positives for Zelensky and some negatives from what we have seen. On the positive side, I think the simple fact that the meeting took place is very important to Zelensky. In recent weeks, we've seen Trump ramping up his rhetoric against Ukraine. As you mentioned in the introduction there, complaining about the amount of money that the Americans have been providing to support Ukraine and its attempt to fight off Russia's invasion. And that escalation of rhetoric has been taking place, of course, in the environment of this presidential election where everything can get heavily politicized, and that's dangerous for the Ukrainians. They don't want to become a political football in an election campaign. So partly trying to damp down any effect of that for Zelensky. And then the other thing that Zelensky needed to do is really to try to get his message across to Donald Trump that the kind of easy deal that Donald Trump has been talking about in his appearances on the campaign trail, this idea that he could just solve the war before even taking office, that is not going to be a solution to this war, that any kind of easy deal that gives massive concessions to the Russians would only be sticking plaster, and the Russians would then later come back for more. So that was the objective for Zelensky in this meeting. In terms of what we've seen of what the two sides have said, well, on the positive side, Donald Trump did say that any deal that came out would have to be fair, and this has been very much the Ukrainians' point. They need a fair peace. But Trump also said, I'm sure that President Putin wants this war to stop. And I think this would be seen as hopelessly naive by many observers of this. Putin, after all, started this war, and he has been waging it with growing intensity ever since. If Putin wanted the war to stop, he could withdraw his troops, as many point out. So I think sort of light and shade for Zelensky in terms of the comments that we've heard, but the fact that this meeting simply happened is definitely a good thing for the Ukrainians.
Congressional support for Ukraine started off bipartisan and solid. Democrats still seem to be on side, but Republicans now deeply divided. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, this politicization of support for Ukraine has been a creeping process, and you do see, the divisions are particularly visible in the Republican camp. You have some traditional kind of hawkish Republicans who have always been, tough on Russia, supporting America's allies around the world. Zelensky has been meeting them in Washington. Yesterday, he had meetings on Capitol Hill with many of those traditional Republicans. Then there's the kind of opposite side of that, which is those who are perhaps closest to Donald Trump's view of the world, a view that is critical of America's allies, that wants to spend less on defense in Europe, that wants to spend less on supporting Ukraine. And that was exemplified recently by an opinion piece written by Donald Trump's own son, Donald Trump Jr., where he said that they need to get to a deal very quickly with Vladimir Putin, the implication being that this would be a deal that would be very favorable to Putin. And then in the middle, there's a group of Republicans who say, well, Ukraine is important, but even more important than that is China, and that needs to be a massive kind of re-diversion of American attention from Europe to China, with European allies taking up more of the slack. So there are these different camps within the Republican Party sort of jostling for influence, and what makes this situation very interesting, but also very worrying for the Ukrainians, is nobody really knows which of those camps would be in the ascendancy if Trump does make it back into the White House, who would have his ear. And of course, it's not just Trump's ear that counts here, it's also Trump's gut. Which way would Trump then potentially go if it does come to a victory for him and suddenly he finds himself in the middle of this situation? So a lot of uncertainty there, and Ukraine really trying to navigate US politics in the middle of this very intense presidential campaign.
OK, Richard, thank you for that. DW International Editor Richard Walker in Washington.
Dr. Susan Stewart is a senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs here in Berlin. She focuses on Ukraine and Russia. Dr. Stewart, after his meeting with Ukraine's president, Donald Trump said he would work with both Ukraine and Russia to end the war. What do you read into that statement?
Well, I read into it that we simply can't know what Donald Trump is actually going to do. I think this will depend on a lot of factors which happen if he is elected. After the election, it will depend on Ukraine's actions. It will depend on Russia's actions. I think he will try to speak with both, but if he may become frustrated with one side or the other, then we may see some rather vindictive actions toward the side that he is frustrated with.
OK, so a bit of a wild card, and it depends mostly on what we hear from Zelensky, from Putin. I mean, let's start with Vladimir Putin. From what you know about him, does Trump actually have that much rapport with the Russian president as he likes to claim?
I wouldn't say that anybody has that kind of rapport with Vladimir Putin. I think we've seen over the years that many very high-level politicians have attempted to speak to him, to establish a rapport, to try to reach agreements with him. And we've seen repeatedly that has failed, that Russia has not followed through on those agreements, and that Putin is out for his own interests. And I think that will continue in the future as well.
And do you think Zelensky's managed to pull Trump into his corner somewhat?
Well, I think it can't hurt that this meeting took place. I think it's a very good thing that it did take place because it shows that Ukraine really wanted to talk to both sides in the U.S. presidential election campaign. So it's very important, especially for Zelensky, because of the problems that happened previously with Trump that were related to the impeachment process, and they had to do with Ukraine. So Ukraine was drawn into American domestic policy. So it's very important for Zelensky now to try to patch that up and establish a decent rapport with Donald Trump.
And Zelensky's also presented his so-called peace plan, or victory plan, as he calls it. There are some who say a ceasefire is finally a realistic prospect with that plan. Do you agree? And is Kyiv's plan the way to get there?
Well, I think it's hard to say at this point. I think it's good to have a holistic plan with economic, diplomatic, military, security elements. But I think that a ceasefire, it's very hard to see what would push the Russian side to agree to a ceasefire. And if they did, it would probably be only a temporary pause, allowing both sides, but the Russian side in particular, to get ready to continue its attack on and its aggression against Ukraine.
And for the moment, Putin is threatening to use nuclear weapons again if Russia is attacked with long-range weapons from the West. How do you view those threats? Is it bluff again?
I think it's unlikely that Putin would choose to use nuclear weapons, but it's certainly not excluded. And that's why it needs to be considered as a factor when taking decisions. On the other hand, we see that if we give in to that as a factor and say that, OK, he could use nuclear weapons, therefore he should get what he wants, that just opens the door to him and to other leaders using that card in the future.
Great to get your insights, Ukraine and Russia expert Susan Stewart. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.